Today we're going over Thailand as our country that is beyond the Western media systems that we know. And Thailand represents a very unique case for many different reasons. For number one, it is an Asian country that's not China. So often in political science and in many fields, when we talk about Asia, we talk about stereotypical countries. We talk about China, or we talk about Japan, or sometimes we talk about South Korea. So Thailand is something different for us to look at. And it's also exciting because there are many attributes about Thai media that we don't see in other cases that we have looked at before. So we're going to look at our four variables, then try to fit them in the models, and then talk about what that means moving forward. So our first variable we're looking at is media structure, measured by newspaper circulation. As we know, this has been a problematic variable, to say the least, and in like all the other countries we've looked at, newspaper circulation in Thailand is considered low. However, differently than other countries is consumption rates. You see, in our models, we're using newspaper circulation rates, the amount that people buy newspapers, to proxy a different variable. The real variable we're interested in is how many people read the news. And so the assumption is if they buy the paper, they're reading the news. Therefore, newspaper circulation rate equals news consumption rate. However, in Thailand, something unique happens. So in cafes, in libraries, in parks, there are newspapers. One person buys it, or a store buys it, a cafe buys it, the library buys it, and it stays there. And many different people read the same newspaper. It's cafe culture. Now, what does this mean for newspaper circulation rate as a variable? It means that in Thailand, newspaper consumption rate does not equal news consumption rate. Thereby, why use newspaper circulation rate? Let's say you have 1,000 papers purchased. You would think that means 1,000 people are reading the paper. Well, what happens if 4 people read the same newspaper? Circulation rate is 1,000, but news consumption rate is 4,000. That's a major issue that we haven't seen or talked about elsewhere. And newspaper cafe culture is something actually very common around the world. Now, granted, here in the States, it's not nearly as big as it used to be, but it's still a very prominent practice all around the world. Something else the author brings up about Thailand that's very interesting is how newspapers are sustained. Some of them, the author suggests, although he doesn't necessarily say he has a lot of proof for it, is that newspapers are sometimes kept afloat, monetarily speaking, by questionable stock market practices. And what they're really meaning is partially the practice of newspapers promoting stocks going in one direction, meaning advertising they're going to go in one direction, and then betting on them and buying in the opposite direction. It's stock manipulation in order to keep newspapers afloat. Now, this is not an exclusive Thai thing. This theoretically happens all over the world, and stock manipulation happens here in the US as well. But it's an interesting dynamic, once again, that we haven't seen before to talk about how newspapers all across the globe are struggling today to stay afloat in the printed form. So they're having to come up with inventive ways to stay afloat. It's really interesting. So, but overall, let's sum it up. Newspaper structures, or newspaper circulation rates in Thailand are considered low. However, news consumption rate is much higher. And because you can't quantify exactly how many people are reading the same newspaper, using this variable really doesn't make sense anymore. Now we're looking at political parallelism, one of our favorite variables, right? How does political parallelism work out in Thailand? Well, the author uses something called partisan polyvalence in order to describe it. Now, from our models, political parallelism, remember, it's the measure of how political parties influence, or how much they influence, newspapers, or media in general, and therefore how biased are they. And they say what we see in Thailand, which is the norm, is that you'll have a certain journalist assigned to a certain politician, and they stay with that politician in the hope that that politician will get big and get elected to a high-level office, and then that journalist is well connected to that politician. So this journalist, by default, is attached to that politician's political party. And in order to keep that connection good, that journalist will want to report favorably of that politician. So on the micro level, on the individual level, it looks like the journalist is biased, that all journalists are biased. However, the author says when you look at the macro level, when you look at all journalists, at any number of journalists within one media outlet being attached to different politicians rather, from different political parties, even though each journalist may be individually biased in one direction or another, any media outlet can have a group of journalists that are biased in all directions. So that's interesting. It's saying that partisanship is the norm, and that these journalists, because all of them are biased in all different directions, that is this really political parallelism? Is this really bias if you're covering all of the political parties in one single organization? So again, it's something we haven't seen, but it's something that maybe happens more frequently than we would tend to think about, and it's directly associated with how we view journalistic professionalism. So journalistic professionalism. Here the author says partisanship is the norm. That the watchdog journalism objectivity that we think about in democratic standards is not the norm. And that, in fact, it's probably more likely that how journalists are partisan and connected to specific politicians in Thailand is more than likely the global norm. He says if you look by the model's standards, the democratic standards of journalistic professionalism, he says of course you're going to say that Thai journalists are not very professional. However, he says if you look at the profession as a whole, even though individual journalists may be biased towards one politician, one political party, that journalists collectively, because they're biased in one direction themselves, they are contrasting each other as a whole. So journalism as an industry is actually pretty objective in his argument. That because on the micro level you are partisan, on the macro level it makes you all objective. This is a pretty novel idea. It's embracing the fact that, hey, partisanship is the norm, but that doesn't mean you can't be professional as an industry for media. Once again, this is something that is outside of the Western world. It's outside of our ideas, our media bubble, about how democratic media should work, about how journalists should work. But let's keep going. Let's look at the role of the state and see what things are there. In the author's discussion about the role of the state, culture comes up very quickly, and rightfully so. In several other cases we've looked at, we've talked about culture and how important that can be. Even in South Africa, we didn't use the word culture necessarily, but 11 official languages and different linguistic groups. Language is part of culture, right? So more and more we're seeing the importance of culture in media. And he says, here there is no difference. And he says, first off, culturally speaking, there are certain out-of-bounds markers, certain taboo things that you just simply do not talk about in media in the country. And one of them is related to a rule or a law called Les Majestés rules, which means you do not talk bad about or insult the monarchy. And Thailand is not the only country that has a monarchy that has these rules. And these rules and laws go back centuries, if not thousands of years over human history. And we'll talk about in a second an example of this actually taking place pretty recently. But outside of this, how else is the state involved? Because if there are certain things that are culturally out of bounds to talk about, the state doesn't have to censor those things. People already censor themselves because you don't talk about it. And there are out of bounds markers in every country culturally speaking, without a doubt. But what about government itself? Well, he also says something very, very interesting about government and people in government in Thailand. Is that different government officials will have different holdings in different media organizations, and that even within government itself, that different organizations will be tied to, be it radio, be it television, be it newspapers, be it internet. And depending on those individuals, they, just like many journalists, also carry their own political bias with them. And that bias will influence how they, in their specific state institution, influence the media organizations that they are connected to. Meaning you could see high state intervention here, as measured by the models, but there's one problem. It's not one-dimensional. It's not in a single direction. That you could have, let's say, 5 different organizations headed by 5 different people going in 5 different directions. Can you categorize that simply by saying that's high state intervention? The author would argue, and I would tend to agree with it, you can't. You would be losing data again by just saying that's high state intervention. You need to acknowledge the diversity and complexity of how the state is involved in order to really get an accurate picture of state intervention in media in Thailand. But now we're going to wrap everything together and then talk more about where Thailand is today. Bringing it all together and moving towards today. The models and the values of the variables. Newspaper circulation low, but misleading. Political parallelism, high, but multidimensional, multidirectional. Role of the state, high, but complex. Journalistic professionalism, low, but by whose standards? All 4 of these values match perfectly with the polarized pluralist model. However, the author argues Thailand is more different than Europe than it is similar. And the fact that it matches so perfectly, remember other models in other countries, it was more of a mixed bag. This one matches so perfectly with the models and yet is so different, further reinforces that these models are flawed when trying to bring them outside of the Western world. And the author brings up a really important question that we're going to address in some of the next few chapters. These models are based on 17, 18 different countries, and we're trying to expand them all around the world. An important question we have not asked: are these 17, 18 different countries the models are based on? Are they the global norm, or are they global exceptions? Are they outliers as far as countries go? And if they're outliers, what are the implications of that as far as comparative analysis? At me in the forums, we'll definitely talk about this. But let's speed up. Let's see where things were going after the text and how things are doing today. Well, one big thing happened in 2014 that the textbook could not have predicted. And that's in 2014, Thailand went through a military coup. All right, so there was a lot of political unrest. There was a lot of political gridlock. Military intervened and installed a military junta. All right, next thing that's happened. So the military junta goes on for 5 years. In between that time, in 2017, a video came online via Facebook and YouTube of the king of the country in a crop top shirt walking around in a mall in Germany. This, as far as Thai government and military was concerned, went against lèse majesté rules. And the military government told Facebook and YouTube, pull them off, block them from Thailand, or we're going to sue you, and we're going to block you from the Thai market. So does anyone want to guess what Facebook and YouTube did? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They took them off. Of course, because they don't want to lose access to potential revenue in the Thai market. So Facebook and YouTube folded to the military government. Then 2 years later, we're starting to get closer, because also in 2017, the military made a new constitution for the country. Early 2019, we're starting to get closer and closer to the first democratic elections since 2014 coup. February of 2019, the sister of the king announces she wants to run for prime minister of the country. She has a whole lot of support. Now, let's remember, Thailand is a constitutional monarchy. Theoretically, constitutional monarchies, the monarchies usually don't have that much power or influence. Thailand is not the same as the constitutional monarchy of Spain or of the UK. The monarchy still holds a lot of majesty, if you will, and a lot of influence. The king came out very quickly after his sister said she wanted to do so and said, "No way, you cannot do this. It violates the Constitution where the monarchy doesn't get involved in politics." However, a lot of Thai people that supported the princess rather, suggested that by the king saying his sister couldn't be in politics, he is being involved in politics. It's an interesting contrast. So his sister was not able to run for office or run for prime minister, and in March of 2019, the election took place. And the new prime minister that was elected was the leader of the military coup and leader of the military of 2014. So that same individual is now the prime minister of Thailand. So we're only just over a year out from that election and democracy returning to Thailand. What does Freedom House and Reporters Without Borders say? Well, 2018 to 2019, Freedom House, Thailand goes from a 30 to a 31. So not much change. Granted, that is in the not free category, but it's on the edge of authoritarianism and the military junta. So it shouldn't be that surprising. Reporters Without Borders takes Thailand from the 140s to the 130s. Also, not much fluctuation. And it's very, very recent. So one thing I'd like you to point out about Thailand right now, and as far as projections, right now, the country is in fluctuation. And we don't have enough data to reasonably say where the country will go from here. Even if you look at trends for Reporters Without Borders, Transparency International, Freedom House, it is just 1 year out since the election. We will simply have to wait and see how media in the country develop going further, since for the first time in 6 years, now the country has returned to democracy. So let's talk about it in the forums. Where do we think Thailand will go from here? I'm interested to hear your thoughts.